Good morning and welcome to the Spring 2024 GSA Forum. We're going to get started in just a moment, but first I would ask that if you haven't already to please sign in using the digital sign-in that's in the chat. And I know folks are joining right now, so we'll give it just a second. Welcome everyone who's just joining us, and good morning. All right, so we're going to get started today. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our Spring 2024 GSA Forum. My name is Atlee Keller and I am with Stantec. We're so happy to see you all this morning. I want to start with some logistical pieces for today's forum. First is that this event is being recorded and it will be made available online when it's ready, along with all the resources that you see coming through the chat throughout today's event. We've also enabled closed captioning, so you can go ahead and turn that on if you would like, going to your toolbar. If you don't see it on your toolbar, the option for captions, you can go to more or the ellipses on your toolbar and it should pop up there. And now we're going to go ahead and get started. To really get things kicked off, I'm going to hand it over to Deputy Director of Sustainable Water Management, Paul Goslin.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the 4th Biannual GSA Forum. We've been launched these forums since 2022, so they've really been, I think, real important for us and for you all to as part of our local assistance to get information out and have good exchanges. And I think these are really, really impactful kind of sessions. So we're really happy everyone's here today. You know, local assistance is critical and a major part of what we do. So today's efforts are going to really highlight a lot of that. You know, today, and we'll be hearing the next 10 years, the entire year, what's happened the last 10 years during SGMA implementation. So this is really going to highlight some of that progress from our panelists and participants, taking a deep dive and engaging conversations about one of our technical assistance efforts that provides the latest data and information about California's groundwater basins to help communities better understand their aquifer systems and to better manage for the long haul and really fulfill the promise of sustainable groundwater management. So I think too, as we take a look at the data and the tools that have emerged over the last 10 years, they were nothing like the status of groundwater management pre-SGMA. And I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that march towards better data acquisition and understanding of basins is going to continue. So I'm really hopeful that this is just the start, and we're going to bring in continue this march towards improvement of data tools and science to better manage basins and make California sustainable for all. So I hope you find today's event fulfilling and great, and look forward to future webinars with you all. And I wish you all the best. And now I'll turn it over to Keith. So have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Paul. Welcome to the Spring 2024 GSA Forum. My name is Keith Wallace. I'm the Assistant Deputy Director for Sustainable Water Management at DWR. I'll be your moderator today, and I'll be assisted throughout the meeting by Atlee Keller from Stantec, who we already met. So I just want to thank you for taking the time to participate in this event. You know, we're really excited to have you all here. We have a packed agenda, which I will cover in a few minutes, along with meeting logistics. But first, I want to talk with you about the overall intent of the GSA Forum series. So many of you, have attended a forum event in the past, so you're familiar with our approach. But for those of you that are new to this forum series, I want to share with you what we're trying to accomplish with these events. As Paul mentioned, our goal is to support you and SGMA implementation. DWR established this platform as a venue for you, the local agencies implementing your GSPs, to come together and engage with one another. And we typically, try to have 2 of these forums, each year, one in the spring and one in the fall, with themes that are focused on implementation topics. And some of our recent themes have included, well management approaches and funding for GSP implementation, But we really, we created this space for you to be able to exchange ideas and interact. But we also want you to be able to highlight, Sigma successes that, to see if they can be replicated in other parts of the state. But then also to share, some of the challenges and lessons learned in hopes of, avoiding, these elsewhere. And then lastly, there's going to be an opportunity here for you to provide some input on state assistance efforts, whether it's in the breakout sessions or in surveys that we have for this event. Next slide, please. So today's discussions, in our engagement and sharing of ideas are going to be centered around one of DWR's technical assistance efforts. And we're going to focus on sort of demystifying the statewide airborne electromagnetic surveys. And specifically what we're going to cover today is how GSAs have used and are planning to use these data to help them implement Sigma, how DWR can continue to support local agencies in these efforts, and how AEM data will inform DWR's basin characterization program, which that's an effort to provide the latest information about California's groundwater basins and help local communities better understand their aquifer systems. Next slide, please. So here's our agenda for today. We have three main components, which include a panel presentation with a question and answer session, where you will hear from GSA representatives. They're going to share their experience with AEM data and Sigma implementation. We also have 2 rounds of breakout sessions where in smaller groups you can discuss successes, tips, and challenges related to using AEM data. And lastly, we're going to have 2 informational sessions on DWR assistance efforts, with one session covering the basics of DWR's AEM survey project and its data uses. And then the second session is going to cover how AEM data will inform DWR's basin characterization program. Next slide, please. So I wanted to cover some of the logistics for today's forum. Please keep your microphone and muted. Please keep your microphone muted and your camera turned off if you're not speaking, other than in breakout sessions. And try to ensure that your Zoom profile includes your first and last name. Also, we're going to be using the Zoom question and answer feature for all the questions for our panel presentations today. We'll go over how to access this feature a little bit later in the program, right before we go through the panel presentations. And then lastly, if you encounter any technical difficulties, please contact Condrell Clark from Stantec via direct message in the chat. Next slide, please. Now I want to turn it over to Catherine Dlubeck from DWR to provide an intro into AEM. Take it away, Catherine.
Great. Thank you, Keith, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Keith, for that introduction. And welcome, everyone, to the Spring GSA Forum. My name is Catherine Dlubeck, and as the project manager for DWR's statewide airborne electromagnetic surveys, I am very excited that this is the topic of the forum this spring. DWR, along with our consultants at Ramble and SkyTem and GEI, had been working very hard over the past few years to collect this airborne electromagnetic data across the state. And I'm very excited to hear about how you all, the GSAs, have been using the data. So very excited for the panel discussions. But also to hear from you guys sharing between each other in the breakout rooms, how you've been using the data, as well as any tips and tricks you found for using the data and challenges you've experienced. And as Keith mentioned, that will help us to define how we launch the basin characterization program, which is aiming really at better supporting you all and the state at using the AEM data and defining our groundwater basins. And you'll hear more about that program as Keith showed later in the presentation from Stephen Springhorn and myself. But at the moment, I'm just going to focus on introducing our AEM surveying project, as well as some data uses, just to prime you for the presentation, for the panel presentations coming up. And let's see. Just want to make sure I can go to the slides. There we go. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so starting out with just an overview of our statewide AEM surveying project. We started this in the summer of 2021. And so now in just about 2.5 years, I see some red lines on the screen. Interesting. In just about 2.5 years, we have completed the data collection portion of this project, where we collected data in all of the high and medium priority groundwater basins where we could collect data. And so in the end, we collected data across 95 partially or fully across 95 high and medium and low or very low priority groundwater basins. So in total, this came out to be about 16,000 line miles of data with this 2x8 mile line spacing, so this reconnaissance grid spacing. But we worked closely with you all, with GSAs, to define those flight paths to ensure that we were not just collecting data to help us improve our understanding of the large-scale aquifer structures, but also placing the flight lines over areas that might inform other applications, like defining recharge areas or along streams to support surface water groundwater interaction, things like that. So that was quite an effort. And here you can see the flight lines that we did end up collecting. I want to also highlight the series of pilot studies that were conducted in California from 2018 to 2020. That was before the launch of the statewide AEM surveying program. That was in Butte and Glenn counties, Indian Wells Valley, and San Luis Obispo. And the purpose of those pilot studies was to demonstrate that AEM data could be successfully collected in California and provide recommendations for the launch of the statewide program. And I just wanted to highlight this because I do believe we're going to hear a little bit about this data set from one of our panel speakers later today. And so also all the data and reports from these pilot studies are available on the Open Data portal. All right. Okay, so diving into a little bit more about what the data are. So we are collecting airborne electromagnetic data. That's airborne geophysical data, which consists of a helicopter that flies along defined flight paths. Beneath it, we tow this large loop of geophysical equipment. As we fly along, we send a signal through this loop that penetrates into the ground, creates eddy currents. We receive those currents when they come back as voltage, and we invert that data for a distribution of electrical resistivity values. The resolution of the data changes with depth. So in the shallow subsurface, we're seeing layers that are on the order of about 10 feet in thickness, and that resolution decreases with depth. So those layers increase in thickness. We can see down to a depth of about 1,000 feet, but we know that that varies depending on where we are in California. So as I mentioned, we're inverting the data for this distribution of electrical resistivity values, where electrical resistivity describes the ability of a material to resist an electric current. But of course, we don't much care about an electric current and whether material resists it or not. But we do know there's a relationship between these electrical resistivity values and material properties that control flow. So we know that less resistive materials and blues correspond to fine grain dominated materials like silts and clays and silts. And more resistive materials correspond to coarse grain dominated materials like sands and gravels. But there are other complications. So less resistive materials could also correspond to a sand that's saturated with a fluid, but has a high concentration of total dissolved solids, or seawater or brackish water. And then we also know that more resistive materials could also correspond to a volcanic material or a hard rock, or something a hard rock volcanic material. So we have to be careful when interpreting the resistivity data for lithology. In the statewide AEM surveying project, we interpreted the resistivity data for texture, where texture describes the coarseness of the material, where a more coarse material would have a 100% coarse fraction, and a less coarse material like a silt and a clay would have 0% coarse fraction. So we created this resistivity to lithology transform by creating, using existing data like digitized lithology logs, geophysical data, and groundwater quality. And we created this transform in a three-dimensional space along the flight lines so that the transform varied and was unique for each node within the space across the flight lines and with depth. So really quite a good bit of effort went into creating this resistivity to lithology transform. And now you can see the areas that were more resistive correspond to aquifer materials like sands and gravels, and that were less resistive correspond to silts and clays, or areas that might inhibit groundwater flow. In areas where we could not create this resistivity to lithology relationship, so in areas that had a significant amount of seawater intrusion or brackish water or hard rock like volcanic rock, we did not interpret the data for texture. So there were some areas where you'll see there was no interpretation. And so in the end, we have this really great rich data set across California. We have electrical resistivity data across the entire state. And then we also have this AEM-derived coarse fraction, or this texture data across the state. And you'll see some of those small holes that I mentioned where we could not create the resistivity to lithology transform. Some of these areas are shown in purple, which were low electrical resistivity areas that could potentially be impacted by seawater intrusion, where we could not create that resistivity to lithology transform. And there's some areas also in gray, where again, we suspected there was hard rock, and so we could not create that resistivity to lithology transform. These are the potential reasons why we could not make that interpretation. So we have this rich data set, and it can be used, let me go back, for lots of different things. And we're going to hear more about all of these applications, or a variety of applications, in the next presentations. But just want to highlight these. We can use the AEM data to support us in creating texture models. So these are the 3D grids showing the distribution of the coarseness of the material in space. And this is just an example of the USGS's Central Valley Hydrologic model version 2, texture model, that doesn't include the AEM data. So for example, this model could be refined by using now the AEM data we have in this 3D that we have along the flight lines that provide a continuous image of texture. So we can use that in the texture models. We can also use it to create a hydrogeologic conceptual model or a hydrostratigraphic model. And this is the model that describes how the various layers of the aquifer system, right? So you can use it to define where you have the primary zone of your aquifer, where you might have a confining layer, or the depth to the aquifer. I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that, using data to help define the bounds of your aquifer system. And of course, both of these bits of information can flow into a groundwater flow model. So the groundwater flow model, of course, is the model that describes how groundwater flows within the aquifer system under various conditions of groundwater pumping and groundwater recharge, what the water levels are doing within that aquifer system. We can also use the data to help us better understand areas where we can recharge. So it can help us to develop recharge suitability maps, as well as aquifer connectivity maps. So what I mean by that, recharge suitability, here I'm just showing a map that we have on the data viewer that shows the average in the top 15 feet, the AEM data. So, or the top 15 meters, the top 50 feet. So what we can do, or what this tells us, is where we can get water along these flight lines very quickly back into the ground, right? So recharge suitability of where we might have a dominant, where the subsurface might be dominated by coarse grain materials. So getting water quickly back into the ground. And then the aquifer connectivity maps will help us better understand where there is a connection between our deeper aquifer and where it daylights, or where those units daylight somewhere within the basin. So for example, these inside valley fills or paleo valleys that we know daylight along the eastern side of the valley, they go deeper into the aquifer where a significant amount of the pumping is occurring. We can map where those units daylight. As I mentioned, we can use the data to help us define areas where we have high salinity zones or seawater intrusion. This process requires the addition of water quality data, so TDS values or other electrical connectivity values from wells along the area where seawater intrusion is suspected. So that requires the relationship, a more refined relationship between resistivity and lithology, to go resistivity to lithology, and also resistivity to seawater intrusion. But it's certainly an application. And then we can also use the data for practical applications like siting wells. So better understanding what the formation looks like. And of course, this goes into the hydrogeologic conceptual model, but understanding what the formation looks like so you know where you want to screen a well, or have an understanding of where you want to screen a well, or how much of well casing you need before you go out into the field. So lots of applications, and we're going to hear more about these in the panel discussions. But I now just want to take a few moments to provide you some information about where you can access the data. Okay, here we go. All right, so all of the data, sorry, a little slow here. Let me go back. Okay, so all of the data that we've collected have been published on the California Natural Resource Agency Open Data Portal. This includes the data reports, so the description of the data collection, along with those, the PDFs showing the images of the data. And then we also have the AEM data itself. So we have the raw data if you want to invert it. We also have the inverted data. So that's the electrical resistivity values versus depth. And then we also have the AEM data interpretation. So all the texture data, all of that is available for you to download, as well as a really, really rich data set that we're not going to talk too much about today, but the digitized supporting data. So the data that we went through, QA, QTC'd, and digitized to create the resistivity to lithology transform. So all of that data is available to download by survey area on the Open Data Portal. But we've also gone through great effort, not just to ensure data access, but data access equity. So to allow the everyday user access the data on a computer. So you don't need to have a specialized expensive software to view the data. We've made it publicly available and accessible for all. We've done this in a few ways. So I first want to highlight the Sigma Data Viewer. This is the data viewer I think you all are aware of. Oh, we're ready to go through. Pause this for a sec. This is the data viewer that I think, sorry about that most of you have seen before. Okay, let me just pause right here. That most of you have seen before, where we have a lot of our different data sets available in map view. So in planar view looking down. And on these, we also have the airborne electromagnetic data, both as the electrical resistivity values with slices versus depth, and also the texture data with slices versus depth. So here what I'm going to show you is a depth slice video going from the fine to coarse grain materials throughout the state. And as we start to go through, we're slicing with depth. You can see the trace of the Feather River up here in the Sacramento Valley and the San Joaquin. You can start to see some of these insides valley fills, or these paleo valleys, as they come off of the Sierras. You can see as they appear and start to deepen into the subsurface. So a lot of great information you can access here. So because we're on the Sigma Data Viewer, we can look at a variety of data sets at the same time that may be of interest. So here I'm showing the average in the top 50 feet or 15 meters, the average of the coarse grain material. So in the areas where we have these reds or oranges and yellows, these are areas where in the top 50 feet, there is a high dominance of coarse grain material. So these could be good areas to recharge or to define recharge locations. We can add on other data sets we have. So this is the USGS's hydrogeologic Central Valley hydrologic model that I showed before, the texture data. So this is an independent data set that also estimates texture. You can see where these line up and match. So there's a good agreement between these. And then you can add on other information like major rivers or creeks or canals and aqueducts to better understand how you can get water from one place to another where you might want to consider recharging it back into the ground. So that is on the SIGNET data viewer. We also have the data available to view as profiles. So looking at the slices of the data. So this is maybe a more traditional view that most folks have seen, where you can see now the texture data or the electrical resistivity data along with the lithology logs. We also can view the data in a 3D space. So this is a video. Okay, I'm going to jump right into it. I think it's playing. Here it goes. Where you can zoom into the data. You can manipulate the data in a 3D space. You can create slices of the data. This is showing texture. I'm just going to highlight, I'm going to highlight here the one of those pathways that I mentioned where we can get from the surface down to a deeper aquifer. So we can see that highlighted here or in this reddish yellow color. So you can create these slices both vertically or horizontally. So you can look at the data with depth. I think what I'm going to show you here next is we also have on this viewer the lithology logs. So here now what you can zoom in and see is all of those digitized lithology logs. You can see them. You can see them classified by lithology here in this 3D space. You can view it along with the AEM data. Here I'm just showing it by itself. And then also those texture classifications. So the coarse or fine classification of the AEM data, of the lithology log data that was used to create the resistivity to lithology transfer. So, I clicked the wrong thing. Sorry about that. All right. So all of these viewers are available and can be accessed from the CNRA, the California Natural Resources Open Data Portal. From this page here, again, we really hope that you are able to use these viewers to explore the data yourselves and also share it with others. All right. Let's see. And I think that's everything I have. So I believe I'll turn it back over to Keith to move on to the panel discussions. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Really appreciate you providing that overview of AEM and the various data sets that we have to share on the data viewer. I think this all lays a great foundation for our panel presentations, which we're now transitioning to. In this segment of the forum, where the GSA representatives are going to walk us through some of their local successes, challenges, and visions for use of AEM data to enhance groundwater management. Each panelist is going to provide a brief, about 10 to 15 minute presentation. And then after all the presentations have concluded, we're going to move into a live question and answer session. And so we ask that you use the Zoom. Keep it here. We ask that you use the Zoom Q&A feature to direct your questions to your panelists. And you can do that through the presentation. You can do it throughout the presentations so you don't have to wait till the end. And how you do this is if you have the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, obviously you can click on that. But if you don't have it, click on the more icon in the toolbar and then select Q&A. So then please note, in addition to logging your own questions, you can upvote or like questions posed by others if you want to hear a response to that question during the Q&A session. Next slide, please. So here's the list of our panelists in order of appearance for today. Include Christina Buck from Butte County Water and Resource Conservation, Cassie Chuen from North Kings GSA, Emily Gardner from Salinas Valley Water Basin GSA, and Victoria Hermosia from Montgomery and Associates, and then Charles Junk from Yuba County Water Agency. Next slide, please. I'll now turn it over to Christina to start us off.
Great, thank you. Good morning, all. You can hear me okay? Hopefully.
Yep.
Great. All right. Thanks. Yeah, welcome. I'm happy to be here this morning and just share a little bit about what we've been doing with AEM in Butte County. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So I'll just dive right in and share a little bit about how we've used, and then mostly really how we hope to use this new kind of statewide data as we go forward into this next phase of filling in data gaps and addressing needed updates or amendments to our groundwater sustainability plans. Next slide. So first, I'll just give a little lay of the land. We are up here in Northern California. So Chico is here in the Vina Subbasin. In Butte County, we work within 3 subbasins, Vina, Butte, and Wyandotte Creek. And the map on the right side there just shows the primary water source for irrigation. So you can see that Vina is primarily blue, indicating groundwater dependent. And Butte Subbasin has reliable surface water supplies with some pockets of groundwater dependent areas. And then Wyandotte Creek is a little bit of a mixed bag between the two. So when we are really focusing on groundwater management in Butte County, often our efforts are targeted at Vina Subbasin, where we have had more groundwater level declines and dry wells during the drought and things like that. So but this is kind of the space that we work in mostly. Next slide, please. So as was mentioned earlier, there was a pilot project that was this partnership between the Department of Water Resources at Stanford and others, and we were one of those local pilot areas. And so we worked also with Dr. Todd Green from Chico State. And mostly this was funded through kind of the DWR technical assistance work. But to get some of this work done on the ground, there was local funding as well from Butte County Board of Supervisors and then Glenn County Partner in Kind Support, doing some of the monitoring that occurred when they were doing the flight lines and really just working closely with them to work through kind of the workflow of if you're going to collect this kind of data, how should that go, and really set them up for doing the bigger statewide piece. So next slide. We really had kind of 2 focus areas. Oh, can you hit again? And one more time, we'll just go ahead and cover all of it. So we really had kind of, as we were approaching the thought of having access to AEM data, potentially deriving questions that we were interested in, and it focused on kind of 2 different areas. So this is the Vina Subbasin. Chico is right here in the middle of the map. And on the western side, it's a relatively data-rich area where we had more monitoring wells. And so some of our questions there was really wanting to better understand the principal aquifer zones. What's the extent and characterization of leaky kind of versus confined system? How extensive were confining beds or clay layers? In the eastern area is a little bit different, kind of coming off the lower foothills and into the valley. There's some uncertainty about basin structure and geometry there. And so wanting to better understand the nature of the transition zone between those 2 systems, and then also kind of anecdotally having shallow saline water in some wells in some places as you go to the east. And so wondering if AEM could help with that as well. So these were some of our, as we were just talking with the team in, before flights were planned, some of our motivating questions. Next slide, please. So again, just kind of refining those and summarizing, we really were generally trying to enhance both the scientific understanding and better define basin geometry and layering. Like I said, mapping out that aquifer structure. What's the connectivity in our Tehama and Tuscan, kind of those are the geologic units in our aquifer systems, and how extensive are these clay layers? We were also interested in potentially gaining insights on the water table, since we have limited monitoring wells that measure water table conditions. And so there was a little bit of work in that space by Stanford folks as well. And then also just more generally to inform groundwater management, right? So these things that we've already talked about, we'll hear more about, I think, today, is improving hydrologic conceptual model, informing representation of the groundwater model, supporting coordination among sub-basin boundaries, recognizing that that western side of the study area really covered, I think 3 or 4 different sub-basins kind of come together in that space. And then optimizing our groundwater management efforts like new monitoring well placement and understanding the recharge pathways. So those were really many of our motivating questions. And it's a lot to kind of take off and bite off and chew with a rich data set like this. But I think we learned some things certainly from that pilot study and wanting to continue to build on a lot of these same pieces. Next slide, please. So this is the image that came out of that study, and maybe you've seen it other places where the data that they collected, both you can see kind of on the eastern side and then largely on the western side, warm colors representing sands and gravels and the cool colors being those clay-rich packages. And next slide. So just a rich data set. We were able to utilize this during groundwater sustainability plan development. So the data was collected in 2018, and we were kind of right in the throes of working on basin setting portions of the plan at that point. And Dr. Todd Green, geology professor at Chico State, was really a key partner in having the local geologic understanding and being able to dive into the AEM data and really continue to interpret it. And so he actually developed this cross-section that ended up in the VINA Groundwater Sustainability Plan and really beginning to help us tease out, how the system is characterized maybe on the eastern side and how it changes as you move to the west. And so we want to do more of that, but this was able to be incorporated into the GSP. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just highlighting too, I think, so we kind of checked the box on better understanding where we had this data, particularly most of the focus in data analysis from the pilot work was in that western side. I think there's more we can learn and some of those questions that we were asking about the eastern side. But this paper that Soggy King and then Rosemary Knight and others wrote and put together kind of dove into that aquifer structure question and exploring the connectivity question between shallower and deeper zones of the aquifer. And so that's been really helpful. And I think then able to take some of this information and then turn back to our groundwater model and say, okay, how are layers represented in the groundwater model, and are there refinements that need to be made, or is it pretty close, and we can continue to refine it in other ways. Next slide, please. So I want to just pivot to where we're going. I think just continuing this kind of on this basin characterization generally, and thinking about the AEM data to be valuable, and like I just said, updating potentially the Butte Basin groundwater model and reevaluating model layering or parameterization if needed. Are we missing any hydrogeologic features that are important? I think particularly, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, maybe in the Butte or Wyandotte Creek subbasins. Recharge evaluations certainly, and also characterization of interconnected surface water, and as I mentioned, sub-basin boundary conditions, really understanding how the system is connected kind of east to west as well as with depth. Next slide, please. So I'll just give a quick highlight for each of the 3 subbasins, kind of what we're thinking. But first, before I dive into that, we like to talk, as we've talked about the AEM data and how we're, wanting to use it locally, or the pilot data, just reminding ourselves and our audience that really it's multiple lines of evidence, right, to understand groundwater. Groundwater is tricky because we can't just get out there in our boots and waders and measure it like you would a surface water stream or reservoir. And so AEM becomes really another piece of the puzzle alongside these other data sets that we've already are maybe more familiar with. The geology, water levels, and monitoring wells, density of ag wells, and domestic wells. And so AEM is just layering in this other piece of information, and I think really also adding a lot of value in being able to visualize this complicated kind of 3D system, which is hard to wrap our head around sometimes. Next slide, please. So for Wyandotte Creek, just specifically, there's this theme of refining our hydrogeologic conceptual model, but there, understanding subbasin structure, it's tucked over here on the eastern side of the valley and has a little bit of different geology going on there. So hoping that AEM can help us better understand that with some of these new flight lines that are available from the statewide survey, which would inform new monitoring wells. We have less, this is a more data poor area, so definitely wanting to put in some new monitoring wells, and the AEM may be a window into where those might be most valuable. And from that perspective, because it's been less data rich, the AEM could help us develop some new cross sections that we may be able to incorporate into future either periodic evaluation or an amendment to the groundwater sustainability plan there. The other piece here is water quality. There's naturally occurring saline conditions in certain geologic units in the Wyandotte Creek subbasin, and so wondering if the AEM can help us with that as well. Next slide. So some similarities for VINA, again, refining the hydrogeologic conceptual model, mostly there related to well placement of monitoring wells. And like I mentioned before, interbasin coordination, definitely interested in recharge evaluations and the interconnected surface water piece. So all of those will be, lenses that we kind of hope to evaluate the AEM data through. Next slide, please. And then finally, Butte Subbasin, some similarities here. I think the distinguishing factor for the Butte Subbasin is the Groundwater Sustainability Plan does identify two principal aquifers in the Butte Subbasin, a primary aquifer and a very deep aquifer. And so right now that very deep is defined if it's greater than 700 feet. Our monitoring wells that are greater than 700 feet deep or screened at greater depths than 700 feet, that they are in the very deep aquifer. And so and we have some geologic cross sections, from historic work by DWR and others, but perhaps the AEM data can help us really refine better, what is it kind of geologically that that is driving that difference that we see in monitoring wells in a primary and very deep system, and can we better define, those two aquifer systems. And then some of the other things that I've mentioned, water quality also around the Sutter Buttes, where there are, shallower zones of naturally occurring salinity, and perhaps AEM can help us kind of map out and better understand that as well. Next slide. And I think I'm just about done. Yeah, so that's where we're headed with the AEM. Thankfully, we have some grant money for both the VINA and the Wyandotte Creek subbasins. And as we implement some of those projects, just really recognizing and urging our consultants to take advantage of the AEM data to help answer some of these questions. So I'll wrap it up with that and turn it back over to you, Keith.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. Really appreciate that. And just for everybody that's participating in the forum, if you have questions for her, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A feature. And again, please note who the question is directed towards. That'll allow us to make it easier when we get into the Q&A part of the session here. Next slide. So next, I'm going to pass it off to Cassie Chewin. I'll turn it over to you right now, Cassie.
All right, thanks, Keith. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks, Christina, for kicking off the forum today. As Keith said, I'm Cassie Chauhan. I'm the North Kings Groundwater Sustainability Agency's Executive Officer, and I'm just going to take you through maybe a little bit of a different perspective, particularly because the Kings Basin is kind of known for very prime soil conditions in the majority, and that's going to become a key word, majority of the basin. So we'll go ahead and get started and welcome any questions as we go through. So this is a Kings Basin perspective, and next slide, please. So just to get our bearings first, the Kings Basin is pretty much right smack dab in the middle of the state. It is a critically overdrafted basin, and we have the distinction of having a determination from Department of Water Resources for an approved groundwater sustainability plan with corrective actions that we're continuing to work towards. And I think that's where the AEM data factors into another tool that we're using to make sure that we're satisfying all those corrective actions so that we can remain in the approved category. We are primarily located in Fresno County. Next slide. And our GSA consists of 7 other GSAs, or our basin, sorry, consists of 7 GSAs. So we have 7 GSAs, almost 1 million acres, and we have a portion of our GSA covers 3 different counties. So definitely a lot of coordination that has to happen. And the thing I just really want to point out is there is, we have really good conditions because we're really sandwiched between the San Joaquin River and the Kings River. So we have a lot of opportunity to make sure that we're beneficially using that water supply as well as floodwaters that come off of those 2 sources, and make sure that we are putting that into the underground for future use. So next slide. Drilling down just a little bit further, those Kings Subbasin GSAs have to stay coordinated, as you all know. And that's for those that have multiple GSAs, you can attest to this, that's more complicated than you might think. And so we are very conscientious of making sure that we're meeting every single month to stay on that coordination pathway and work on our GSP revisions, work on implementing programs, et cetera. And most of the things that I'm going to talk about as it relates to our work in AEM is spreading across multiple GSAs. So I will cover that and discuss that a little bit further as we get into some of the specifics. Next slide. So the North Kings GSA is 312,000 acres. So drilling down just a little bit further, it was formed in 2016 through a Joint Powers Authority agreement. And the thing I really wanted to talk about in this particular slide is the way we're structured. It may be a little bit different, and I get this question a lot as it relates to specifically the North Kings GSA about, what projects is the North Kings GSA doing? What are you doing to mitigate for the pumping that's occurring within your GSA boundary? And the distinction here is that the way we were formed back in 2016, before I was even part of the GSA, was every entity within the North Kings GSA wanted to be somewhat in control of their own destiny. And because of that, they wanted to be responsible for doing the projects within their agencies to offset and mitigate for the pumping that was occurring within their boundary. So you can see here, we have City of Fresno, we have City of Clovis, large urban areas, but then we also have Fresno Irrigation District, a large agricultural area, and then we have the white areas to the north part of the map where those are covered by Fresno County. So any of the white areas, primarily Northeast Fresno area, are covered and the responsibility of Fresno County. And that becomes important because I will talk about the prime soil conditions and conditions that we have for recharge to occur in the majority of the GSA boundary, but then we all have that one area that keeps us awake at night, and because of the challenges associated with being able to do these traditional projects that we've really been well versed in that particular area. So just to give you some perspective, the way we accomplish this in terms of establishing those targets, we have little mini water budgets for each of the agencies based on their inputs and outputs. And each agency has been assigned an initial mitigation target. So we're constantly looking at that, refining that based on data sets. But initially we had some agencies that were in overdraft. So City of Fresno, surplus, sorry. City of Fresno, City of Clovis, back in 2004, they converted primarily over to surface water usage. And so they are very well positioned to meet their mitigation targets and remain in surplus. And then we have others that have overdraft conditions ranging from about 150 acre feet to about 3,000 acre feet. So not huge numbers. Again, very well positioned with the 2 rivers and the amount of work that we've done in this space and the water supplies associated with the irrigation district and the cities. but still it's in these areas where we don't have real good solutions. And so it causes you as a GSA manager to really, utilize tools like AEM to make sure that you are working towards those solutions. Next slide. So this is you've seen this graphic before, and I just want to highlight there are a lot of issues that we're dealing with in the Kings Basin, primarily related to declining water levels, declining groundwater storage. Water quality is a huge concern, and then the interconnected surface waters because of the two surface water sources that we have. We don't have as much, and I'm saying we don't have it, but we don't have as much land subsidence occurring within the Kings Basin, and seawater intrusion is not an issue for us. Go ahead. So utilizing some of the exhibits just to emphasize, and when I was first asked to talk on the panel, I almost felt a little bit guilty because we really do have prime soil conditions to do a lot of recharge and get a lot of water into the underground. And you can see here with all of the, this is directly excerpted from our groundwater sustainability plan. In the majority of the Kings Basin, we have really prime soil conditions for recharge. We do have the problematic zone, which is the northeast portion, which I've already talked about. And that's the areas throughout the map that are shown in brown. It's definitely challenge areas. And we've got to figure out, utilizing tools like AEM, how to address the pumping that's occurring in those areas. And particularly in that northeast area, they don't have a surface water supply. So it's all groundwater dependent, and they don't have a real good lithology to be able to get water into the underground. So again, 80% of the GS or the basin is pretty well positioned to do a lot of groundwater recharge, and it's that 20% that we spend a fair amount of time looking at solutions for and assisting, as the North Kings specifically, that agency, which happens to be Fresno County, identify projects and tools that we can use to better define what's happening in that area. Next slide. So that particular area in the Kings Basin is about 36,000 acres of land, and Fresno County is looking at what are we going to do. We know we have tighter soil conditions. It's literally at that transition zone between the hard rock areas and the alluvial soils. What solutions do we really have outside of just restricting the pumping? And the other, just to complicate it even further, is there's not a ton of, there are a lot of de minimis pumpers in that area, and a lot of open range land and open ground. So it's really, what are we going to do? How are we going to utilize AEM to address specifically that area that we know we have to mitigate between 500 and 1,000 acre feet of overdraft condition with very limited possibilities? We know that AEM data can help. There are a lot of holes in the ground. We have a lot of e-logs. We have a lot of data points in that particular area. But we also know that walking 10 feet one direction or the other can really impact whether the potential for recharge to occur and water to really make its way down into the aquifer. So we are looking at better understanding that area, helping, just like Christina talked about, helping to better define what's happening between the data points so that we can be efficient about how we utilize any dollars available for these projects and have the most benefit from that project once it's completed. Next slide. So we too were in the early coordination path with Rosemary Knight and her team, Sagi at Stanford. And we really were the second piece of the work that Stanford was doing in the Central Valley area. They really started down in Cahuilla Basin with Aaron Fukuda, one of my colleagues down in that basin. And when they were done there, they were going to continue to expand their flights, and it was going to come into the Kings Basin area. So Rosemary called and wanted to know if we wanted to get together to try to help identify the most efficient paths that we could take so that we could help inform this problematic transition zone area. So we worked directly with Rosemary and her team and on identifying those flight paths that would be most beneficial. You can see they're all in that problem area that I've talked about previously. And through that process, we're able to define multiple flight plans, support that effort by providing the information that we know, which is the data from our monitoring wells and other wells that are located within that area, and essentially augment the information that we already know in that area and try to find that prime location to achieve more recharge in that particular zone. We also were introduced to the ground truthing, I call, tool, which, you take the 1,000-foot shot and you're using the AEM data, and then you can use the TTEM data to really get on the ground and better define the exact location and potential for a recharge. And that's really important because our experience, and I'll talk a little bit about how much and how long we've been doing these recharge type projects. What's really important is having a willing seller. That's what we found. Like, it's really hard to secure land. And so having a willing seller and then being able to use these tools, once you have those potential proposed locations identified, having this type of data to prioritize and help identify the best location out of the ones that you've identified using the willing sellers that you have found. Next slide. So through that effort, we were able to, and you can see all the flight paths they took and the concentrated area that they did. Initially, they were just focused on the area that was right along the foothills and that transition zone. And through the input from the GSAs, they were able to go further inland and be able to identify this IVF that is essentially confirming what had previously been identified and better defining that particular reach. The locals in that GSA, and it happens to be the Consolidated Irrigation District and Central Kings GSA, they've known that particular region is prime for recharge, and have cited basins accordingly, but this essentially was confirming that and maybe expanding even beyond where the area which they had previously identified as being really prime for recharge. So it's a fairly large area. And again, I think it was Catherine in the opening slides was talking about where are those best locations where you can have fast paths for recharge. And this is one of those areas where we just know the soil is such that we will be able to get a lot of water into the underground and be able to achieve maximum benefits from that particular effort. Next slide. So I put this slide in because as part of the work that we were doing early on as part of that pilot program, I essentially had equated it to finding a needle in a haystack. Like, you have this area, there's opportunities in that area, and we just have to be able to utilize those tools to drill down and be able to find that needle in the haystack. And it's important because all of these, prior to this type of data, we were just doing soil borings. We would find an identified owner who said they had a piece of property that would be prime for recharge type activities, and you would do expensive soil borings. And so this allows you to use the AEM data as another tool, the TTEM data as another tool, as you're evaluating that location for a recharge project. And I think the recharge suitability is probably the biggest benefit that we see from AEM data. And it's particularly in that area where we know we have challenge and where we know we're going to have to spend money and really be diligent about citing those locations so that we can achieve the desired outcomes. Next slide. So the Kings Basin has a really long history. I've talked about our problem area. I just want to talk about, the long history that we have within the Kings Basin of doing recharge. I often say we were doing recharge before recharge was cool, dating back to the 70s. And, we're really being intentional about trying to make sure We are taking advantage of those prime soil conditions, getting as much water into the underground as possible in those wet years, and 2023 is a prime example. Just to give you an indication of the order of magnitude that we're able to achieve, in 2023, we were able to put about 500,000 acre-feet of water into the underground. So that was recharged just within the Kings Basin footprint. And that's phenomenal because that includes all of our historical recharge sites, but it also includes sites that have been built since 2020. So since 2020, there's additional 18 acres of dedicated basins, either purchased, in progress, and or active, such as the one that you see on the screen. It's about 700 acres, about 15,000 acre-feet per day. And that's the prime soil conditions that I'm talking about, that we can get about a half a foot to a foot, and in some locations even more than a foot of water into the underground per day. So that is great. Again, I just want to emphasize our primary consideration, initially at least, is finding that willing seller, because that is post Sigma, that's becoming more and more and more challenging. And even before Sigma was implemented, it was very challenging. So we love all the tools and we utilize the tools, but our first attack of identifying a location is finding a willing seller and making sure that we have the budget to purchase that piece of land. And then we can take it from there and maybe avoid some of the more expensive and costly soil borings, and utilize the data that we have and evaluate sites utilizing the AEM data, the TTEM data, and some of the other tools that DWR has put on the website. And I will say, if you have not, those, when I first started working in this space, AEM data was a little bit overwhelming. It's a lot. And I think Christina mentioned it's complicated and it's hard to analyze, especially if that's not your expertise. But DWR has really done a great job of boiling it down and giving us some tools that make it understandable, even for those that are not as ingrained in the geophysics and looking at that data. So this is a tool that we do see, even with the really good soil conditions that I've talked about and the ability to get a lot of water into the underground, we see applicability even in the Kings Basin, and are looking forward to better utilizing that moving forward as it relates particularly to that area in Fresno County, but then also other areas as more and more recharge sites are coming online and or being planned. Next slide. So we achieve this. This is another thing that's maybe a little bit unique and again, a tie to AEM data. We achieve this through a cooperative effort. I mentioned those large urban areas that we have within the GSA boundary, and that also they're part of the recharge program or the recharge equation. So we have the cities doing recharge, we have Fresno Metropolitan Flood Control District doing recharge and intertying basins with the FID canal system, Fresno Irrigation District canal system, so that we're really maximizing the potential within the basin and within the GSA to get the most amount of water into the underground. And I mention that because, one, I think it's a really great program and it just exponentially increases what any individual agency is able to do, but it also expands the opportunity for those other types of agencies to use AEM data. I think we've used it a lot and or will be using it a lot at the GSA level, but there's opportunity for flood control districts to use it. There's opportunity for cities to use it. There's opportunities for others who are in the business of doing groundwater recharge to utilize that same data set to help with decision making. So I just am a fan and appreciate the opportunity, one, to share what we're doing in the Kings Basin, not to be the envy of everyone in terms of the prime soil conditions we have, but just to really emphasize, even if that's your reality and you can do a lot of recharge and you have prime soil conditions to do that, there's still applicability with AEM data. And I appreciate Stanford reaching out. I appreciate DWR and the work that they're doing and really helping to better define and connect the dots, find the needle in the haystack, particularly in those problem areas, and help us to make better decisions and make sure that those dollars that are being dedicated towards those projects are getting the results that we expect when we do those types of projects. So I think that was my last slide. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Cassie. Really appreciate that. Please enter any questions you have for her in the Zoom Q&A feature. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to pass it off to Emily Gardner and Victoria Hermosia. Take it away, Emily and Victoria.
Great, thank you. So I'm Emily Gardner. I'm the Deputy General Manager at the Salinas Valley Basin Groundwater Sustainability Agency, and I've invited Victoria Hermosia today, who works with Montgomery & Associates, who are our primary consultant that helped us develop the GSPs, and who also conducted the deep aquifer study that we'll talk about a little bit today. So we're excited to briefly share our experience using AEM data in the Salinas Valley, and please go on to the next slide. So here's a map of the Salinas Valley Basin. The valley itself stretches about over 90 miles along the central coast. Salinas Valley Basin GSA jurisdiction is within Monterey County, so you'll see the county line on the bottom there. And the basin itself extends into our southern county, but our jurisdiction is only within Monterey County. We have 6 basins, which we generally refer to as sub-basins. I'll just briefly outline each of them so you know, because we're going to talk a little bit more about the differences in the next slides. But in the northern part, we have the 180-400 sub-basin. In turquoise, there's the Langley. And then just to the south west is the Monterey sub-basin, and then the adjudicated Seaside Basin, which is not within our jurisdiction. And then in the yellow, we have the east side sub-basin, and then continuing south, the Forebay and the Upper Valley sub-basin. We have a few partner GSAs, one Marina Coast in the Monterey sub-basin there in the north, and then the Arroyo Seco GSA in the Forebay, and then the County of Monterey in the 180-400. So with these 6 different sub-basins, we do have a lot of heterogeneity across the valley, a lot of differences. We have 6 GSPs, and varying degrees of overdraft, kind of starting with a critically overdrafted sub-basin in the 180-400 to medium priority sub-basins in the southern end. We are also working in an area where there was a water resource agency, a county water resource agency in place for many, many years that have a monitoring network that we really rely on a lot of our data for SGMA compliance. However, the existing water resource agency jurisdiction does not match. Their jurisdiction is countywide, but their monitoring programs don't match the Bulletin 118 basin boundaries. So we do have some data gaps as a result of that we've been striving to fill. So we have a large data gap in the southern end, bottom of the Upper Valley sub-basin. We have some around the edges in the north, and then there's also deep aquifers underlying the northern basin. And there's an unmet need to conduct a study to really understand the deep aquifers that are underlying the northern area, which we're going to go into in the next few slides. We also have the Langley and East Side subbasins here that aren't directly adjacent to the Salinas River, which is our primary source of recharge in the area. So there's those areas are definitely ones where we're really interested in managed aquifer recharge to increase supply. I liked Cassie's analogy of the needle in the haystack. There's a lot of heterogeneity up there. A lot of the underlying geology we know is going to add a lot of complexity to pursuing recharge in those areas. But we're going to briefly cover kind of how AEM ties into both data gaps, studies, and then future project site development going forward. The next slide, please. So the AEM data that DWR provided back in 2021, 2022 has really provided like a kickstart for us filling our data gaps, especially where we're characterizing areas, like I mentioned, in that southern part of the county where they haven't really been extensively studied before. There's limited wells. It's primarily rangeland. And with that kind of sparsely populated area, we were very happy that DWR was able to really fly a nice grid in that area to really kind of get us started with understanding what's happening there. And so that's that kind of, big broad brush filling data gaps. It's really a really helpful tool as we're getting into analyzing the data, and kind of why I brought Victoria Hermosillo along here. Our consultants are now diving into developing our hydrogeologic conceptual models, and then in turn developing our model layers, which will go into our groundwater models and basically update all of our modeling outputs that we're able to run. And then finally, kind of like in a more specific way, then we can begin to identify actually project-specific sites through that kind of iterative process that Cassie was talking about, as far as if there is a potential site that at kind of the first glance of our initial AEM data shows there might be some recharge potential, then we can start getting into some more site-specific investigation about the recharge potential. Next slide. So as I mentioned in the introduction, we have known that there are deep aquifers within the Salinas Valley that people have been tapping into over time. We have this is a simplified version representing the deep aquifers in the Salinas Valley. We have a layered aquifer system where seawater has intruded the shallower aquifers along the coast. So deeper wells were drilled over time into the deep aquifers. We've measured groundwater declines over time. And when we were writing the GSPs, there was definitely a call for a better understanding of how these deep aquifers are getting recharged, how much extraction they can support, the extent of the aquifers, and if there is a risk of subsidence and further seawater intrusion. So the need for this deep aquifer study was identified in 2 of our GSPs, and was a pretty critical work stream for us to get done in the first few years of our GSP implementation. Next slide. So the deep aquifer study, the GSA joined several partner agencies, public water utilities, landowners. We all joined together into a cooperative funding agreement and selected Montgomery & Associates to conduct the study, which eventually took about 2 years to complete. It was just published a couple weeks ago, so this is great timing. I put a little link to the study there at the bottom of the slide. That's available on the GSA website. The study, was really extensive and developed a more refined definition of the deep aquifers, primarily residing under this aquitard below the 400-foot aquifer, which Victoria will elaborate a little bit more on. And the study really gives our local agencies the foundation to really just get started managing the aquifers, like the HCM, water budgets, monitoring recommendations. But in regard to identifying really the extent of the aquifers, the AEM data was really a critical data source for the study. And the AEM data was used in tandem with other data types, and kind of how all of those data types kind of came together to allow us to really paint the picture of the deep aquifers and really further our understanding, is something that Victoria will go into in the next slide.
Thanks, Emily. And thank you everyone for being here. We were very grateful for the statewide AEM surveys. And as Emily mentioned, that was a real starting point for starting to look into the subsurface in a very detailed way. But for the deep aquifer study, these aquifers are deeper than the statewide surveys could look into. So we partnered with Ramble, and they were fantastic partners in the deep aquifer study to have a more powerful tool, and to fly the helicopter slower to collect deeper data. And this was really crucial in looking for the full extent of the deep aquifers within the Salinas Valley Basin. And just a quick note, we say deep aquifers plural because when they first were drilled into and developed, following the historical nomenclature of the 180-foot aquifer or the 400-foot aquifer, those average depths of production within the Salinas Valley Basin, the deep aquifers were first noted as the 800-foot aquifer, the 900-foot aquifer, the 1100-foot aquifer, and so forth until wells started being drilled and installed with 800-foot screens, right, spanning multiple productive zones within this deeper zone. So we say deep aquifers, plural, to kind of encompass a lot of the places where we find productivity in the subsurface. So moving on to the AEM part, we had a few lines from the statewide survey area 1, that just started to get at just barely the top of where we would be looking. And then we needed more refinement. So we developed maps, and we'll show the maps in future slides, of where we wanted to have more flight lines and more flight lines with a deeper view into the subsurface to really find where these aquifers and the aquitard that delineated them were. We combined that with aquifer testing. We combined that with groundwater chemistry, partnered with the Water Resource Agency, and we included isotope analysis. So as others have mentioned, a lot of the power of AEM data comes when it is combined with other sources of data. And in working through the deep aquifer study, you know, we had a lot of work to do, not only to define the deep aquifers and determine the extent, but also to understand the relationship with other aquifers or other sediments or other geographic locations within the basin. So combining all of these data with AEM data made for a very robust study and a more thorough understanding of this aquifer system. Next slide, please. So here's that map. The map on the right shows several of the AEM surveys that have already been conducted in the Salinas Valley Basin. So starting with actually a 2019 Marina Coast Water District coastal survey that was focused on identifying seawater intrusion in the subsurface. There had a very refined grid. We used a few select lines further away from the seawater intruded areas. We combined that with the DWR 2020 survey and the DWR 2022 survey, which was also coastally focused. That was survey area 8. And then, of course, through the duration of the study, we collected those deeper data with the flight lines. So you can see on the map on the right, very, very refined flight lines through this smaller basin compared to the Central Valley Basin, but it was crucial in looking for the deep aquifers. And we combined this with several borehole geophysical logs, those E-logs, to verify a lot of the AEM resistivity data. A lot of these borehole logs had already been provided for the DWR surveys to really line up the AEM data in the subsurface. We were able to, through the course of the study, to procure several more E-logs that had not been previously provided, and that helped to refine the AEM data even further. And so the other thing that is shown on this map that I want to point out is the final deep aquifers extent that was determined by the combination of that AEM data along with borehole logs, along with surface geology, subsurface geology, and other data that we were able to combine and say, this is the extent of the deep aquifers based on our definition, which focuses on the presence of an aquitard, but includes things like geological formations and depth at which this production occurs. So next slide. So this is an example of one of those deeper lines. So this flight path here is further inland of the subbasin. There's a map on the upper right-hand corner which shows the seawater intruded area sort of in peach right there along the coastline, all of our flight lines, and then this flight line is highlighted in red, and it goes across the basin. And this is a fantastic cross-section because it shows a lot of the data that we were grappling with and a lot of the back and forth conversations we had about what's in the subsurface and why that matters. One of the challenges that we came across is that there's a lot of clay in this basin, a lot more than we had perhaps anticipated, but the clays and the finer materials in this basin are derived from multiple different sources, right? So we have transgressive and regressive seas, which have helped to develop a lot of the aquatards that separate our stacked aquifer system. Of course, there's the various fluxes over time with the Salinas Valley River, erosional forces, and then there are alluvial fans that come off of the Gavilan Range, which is on the east side of the valley, and those have a strong presence of clay as well. And so defining the deep aquifers by the presence of an aquitard or an area of higher clay content that separates it from other productive zones, while that was important when we said, okay, we're marching forward and we're looking for this aquitard, we're looking for this clay, and then the AEM data shows, well, you got a lot of clay, so which clay are you looking for? And the figure shown here, the AEM survey, we have highlighted the deep aquitard in the red box, right? This deeper area in the subsurface where there's this higher clay content separating productive zones. And then circled with the black dashed line is the presence of the alluvial fans. The basin really is, when we look in the subsurface, kind of these two regimes where we have the transgressive regressive seas and the Salinas Valley River deposits over time, and then at the same time erosion occurring off of the Gavilan Range, depositing these huge alluvial fans. And it was very neat to see that the AEM data showed almost a classic textbook sketch of an alluvial fan profile in the subsurface. So this also helped us to delineate which clays belong to which sedimentation environment and which were the ones that we were specifically looking for to define the deep aquifers. So we went through carefully, flight line by flight line, well by well, borehole by borehole, where we had those borehole geophysical logs, historical cross sections that helped us to identify different geologic formations where they were available, and lined this out as carefully as possible to really say, where are the deep aquifers and where aren't the deep aquifers? And this slide really clearly shows how we made those determinations. Next slide, please. So this was in part of the discussions we had with Ramble of how we could try to get at that deeper data, because again, the DWR surveys just did not go deep enough for our needs for the deep aquifer survey. So in order to increase the depth of investigation, we used a more high-powered system, which was very important to send that electricity deeper into the subsurface, and we used a larger receiver. And so this sketch, it's a very technical sketch, but it kind of shows how we were trying to get at those later time gates of receiving the data back from the subsurface to get at those deeper depths. And so we as a team, Ramble, added more time gates later so we could really try to collect as much from the deeper subsurface as possible. So this is just a slide that shows that. Next slide, please. When we talk about how the AEM data helped us to refine our understanding of subsurface lithology, you know, in the process of writing the GSPs, we just had to use the best data and the best information possible, knowing that we would be able to refine it as time went on. And this is a great example of that. The cross-section on the left is a published cross-section from 2004 that was used in the East Side Subbasin GSP. And they did a great job looking through well logs, characterizing all of the sediments that were described in each of these well logs, and making the determinations of where the aquifers and aquitards were. But then what we have on the right side is we have this AEM profile that is very, very close to where this cross section was located. And it's a much more refined view of the subsurface. We can trace where the aquitards and aquifers are much more clearly. And again, this is such a great image of what those alluvial fans coming off of the Gavilan Range look like. Just a very, very classic shape from textbooks, and it's confirmed with some of the well logs, but shows up so brightly in the AEM data. And then the black dashed line was sort of that initial depth of investigation that we needed to get past, that we wanted to look further into the subsurface to try to find those deep aquifers. But again, this is an image that also really clearly shows the difference between depositional environments, the alluvial fan depositional environment, and then the more river-based and transgressive, regressive, ocean-based depositional environment in this area. So taking these published cross-sections, which were a good starting point, taking the statewide AEM data as a good start point, and then pushing all of this further to really refine our understanding at greater depths where we know production is occurring. Next slide, please.
All right, Emily, back to you. Yeah. So building on kind of our improved understanding of the alluvial fans and where that bedrock is really interfacing with the edges of the basins, we're just much better prepared to begin to really start work on identifying sites where we can potentially do some recharge projects. We're just getting started on this work. We're working with UC Davis, who are going to help us develop a multi-criteria decision-making analysis, and then develop some recharge suitability mapping, using existing data, trying to capture a lot of our varying community needs in our areas, and then really mapping the soils and then the available runoff that we'll have to recharge. This is again specifically related to those basins that are further away from the Salinas River, because that's kind of our best hope for additional supply there in the shorter term to help augment the shallower aquifers there. So again, as Cassie alluded to, or spoke directly to, really, we have the AEM data to help better characterize generally. Our hope is to then narrow potential options based on further totem data, and then also, again, working with interested landowners, and then doing more site-specific analysis there as different sites become available to do further investigations on. And then finally, the really site-specific analysis where we do actual soil borings and really dive into specific project opportunities. So that'll be hopefully work that we're going to be embarking on in the next several years. But again, starting with the foundational AEM data for our whole area is really a great place to start. Next slide. So just a few conclusions. AEM data was a critical component of our deep aquifer study and our ability to characterize the aquifer. And I think that the enhanced look into the deeper areas was a really critical tool for us to get that study done. I think that the data resolution is something that we talk about a lot, and something that we talked about when DWR first approached us about where we need to put these flight lines. And it's not possible to characterize every corner of our basin, and especially with the aerial surveys, where it's densely populated. But it is a good first cut, an area to fill in areas of uncertainty. In our coastal area, where we do have the seawater intrusion, it is a limitation because it's really hard to separate the high saline water with the clay soils. But it is a good first brush of really better understanding our whole area. And the AEM data in particular in the east side helped us really understand where the bedrock was coming in, where those alluvial fans are and the aquifer interface, which allowed us to update our HCM model layers and will then help us get started on some more project-specific work. And we're probably going to continue to try to do additional TTEM surveys to keep developing and refining specific locations for recharge projects. And that's it. Next slide.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you very much.
Oh yeah. Thank you for presenting. And if you all have questions for either of them, please enter it into the Zoom Q&A tab. Next slide. So next, I'm going to pass it off to Charles John. Charles.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Well, I'm going to swing you back up to Northern California here. I'm with Yuba Water Agency. I'm going to speak to you about how we've been improving groundwater management through application of AEM data in the Yuba subbasins. So next slide. First, a little bit about Yuba Water. We formed in 1959 due to catastrophic flooding in Marysville and the surrounding communities, and the need for a reliable water supply. So really our primary mission is flood risk reduction and water supply reliability for the citizens of Yuba County. We operate the Yuba River Development Project, just funded through hydroelectric power generation, and supports recreation in New Bullards Bar Reservoir, which you can see at the top of the screen there, and fish habitat enhancement along the lower Yuba River below Inglebright Dam. So we supply on average about 260,000 acre-feet of water to 8 water districts in the North Yuba and South Yuba subbasins. The farm over 60,000 acres of rice, walnuts, peaches, and other crops. North and south of the Yuba subbasin and east of the Feather River there. Next slide. Okay, so AEM is really built on enhancement, built on a solid data source that we have implemented for groundwater management. And AEM was flown in the Yuba subbasins in spring of 2022. And those AEM resistivity flight lines are shown there on the right, and the subbasins outlined in the white line. We received funding from the DWR Prop 2 grant implementation to conduct both a recharge suitability study and to refine our Yuba groundwater model. Next. So first, talking about the recharge suitability study. Next slide. A recharge suitability index was developed based on those 5 sub indices shown here, which represent conditions more or less suitable for managed aquifer recharge. And each sub index here was binned into 1 of 5 scores based on recharge suitability, and then weighted on its importance for recharge, applicability of the recharge method, and confidence in the data set. Next slide. So we used AEM data mainly for the sediment coarseness and preferential pathways sub-index, which I'll talk about here. Next slide. So starting with the sediment coarse sub-index, the main purpose here was to identify the relative permeability of storage capacity and storage capacity of subsurface materials. We use the DWR AEM texture coarse fraction data set and texture data from well logs. Next slide. And so from that evaluation, created these maps and showing a shallow interval map on the left and a deep interval map on the right. The brown areas indicate areas that are least suitable for recharge, and the green areas indicate areas that are more suitable for recharge. Next. So what these maps really highlight is showing a few things, including the Yuba River, circled in blue there, as a significant source of recharge of the higher amount of coarse materials. Also, the historical paths where the river traveled and rework sediments from gold dredging. Next. These maps also highlight areas where there's significant clays in the shallow interval, as seen in those brown areas. Yuba County is a significant source of rice production, And so the farmers really take advantage of the shallow clays, as can be seen here. And so they're good for rice, but bad for surface recharge. So I'm like, we've a little bit envious of Cassie and the Kings GSA down there, and the plentiful area for recharge. We really have limited locations for recharge, really due to these clay layers and shallow groundwater levels. But there are some opportunities that we can consider. Next slide. Additionally, our analysis highlighted smaller creeks and areas on the eastern side of the boundary in the foothills that have potential areas for recharge. Next. Okay, so the other index where we used AEM data was the Preferential Pathways Index. And this purpose here is to identify potentially connected areas of coarse materials. It evaluated really what was laterally connected beds. We used the same 3D coarse fraction model as the sediment coarseness sub-index, applied filters to map those materials, and the geometry of the resulting volume were used to identify recharge locations. So next slide. And so this map is what you see is created from that analysis. And the green areas mean larger connected, larger beds, whereas the yellows and browns are smaller connected beds. And we can see, again, along the Yuba River in the middle, between the North and South Yuba Subbasin, there's large connected beds that indicate areas where groundwater can flow quickly, prevent mounding, and reach the water table quickly. This level of data, of detail and analysis wasn't possible with previous data due to limited quality borehole data. Next. Okay, so we're really in the initial steps of this recharge project, and we still are looking at identifying what is the best recharge method in our basins, whether on-field recharge, preserving natural stream beds, recharge basin development, dry wells, and or ASR wells. We have more work to do with evaluating sources of water, conveyance, and water delivery timing. And we need to reach out to landowners and public entities to gauge interest, go through the environmental evaluation process, design and plan projects. We have a pilot test as part of the grant. And then develop really a long-term plan for putting water back in the ground. Some of the challenges that we've experienced, as others have talked about, include the flight lines and the interpolation of data, the quality of the data in between flight lines. Some of the flight lines were as much as 5 miles apart. Additionally, the hydrogeology, as I talked about, there's abundance of clay layers in the North and South Yuba Subbasin, limiting recharge and the shallow groundwater levels. All right, next slide. Okay, the other significant area where AEM has contributed to improving groundwater management is refinement to the Yuba groundwater model. Next slide. This is a model that's based on the IWFM 2015 version, incorporates the last 30 years of hydrogeologic conditions, land use, crop patterns, surface water divisions and diversions, and groundwater pumping. You can see a cutout on the right side of the slide here of the model, showing the different layers. We essentially have 5 layers in our basins, starting with the recent alluvium on the top, the riverbank formation, the Laguna Formation, Merton Formation, and Ion Formation at the bottom. Next slide. Okay, so what you see here is the AEM flight lines intersecting with the Yuba groundwater model. And to refine the model, we identified contacts at really distinct resistivity changes near the existing model layers. You can see where the flight line changes in resistivity from higher to lower lines up with fairly close to the model layers. And these contacts were used to refine the top and bottom surfaces for those model layers. So the refined model will be used to update our 5-year GSP, which is due in January of 2025. And the surface water and groundwater budgets that make up that update will address depletions of interconnected surface water and projected future conditions using the updated model, as well as future annual reports, project management actions, and the Yuba groundwater model is a large player in conjunctive use management in the U.S. subbasins as well. So, next slide. All right. So to summarize it all, DWR's AEM data significantly improved management in groundwater management in the Yuba subbasins by helping identify recharge areas and improve our model, and contributing data for policy discussions. I mentioned the challenges about uncertainty between flight lines, and some ideas for future improvement include more focused AEM studies with tighter flight lines, adding surface geophysical methods such as ground penetrating radar and seismic surveys, and borehole geophysics to improve understanding of the lithology of the subbasins. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
No, thanks, Charles. Really appreciate it. If you all have questions for him, please enter into the Zoom Q&A tab. Next slide, please. All right. Well, just first wanted to thank everybody again for sharing a little bit about what you've done in your respective basins to utilize AEM data. We really appreciate that. We're going to move into our question and answer portion of the panel discussion now. We are running a little bit short on time, actually quite short on time, unfortunately, but we really want to make sure we get to our break because we only have 5 minutes for that. And we want to make sure everybody's rested and ready for the second half of the forum. So there's probably time for us to get through the 3 questions that I see in the Q&A tab today. But if we don't get to anything, we'll do our best to follow up with you after the forum. So I think what I'll go ahead and do is just jump right in. And it looks like I'm going to do it in order of entry here. So I think going back to Christina, says, can you talk more about the process to correlate lithologic logs from borehole data with the AEM resistivity data? How did low quality logs or poor data impact the process to create the resistivity to lithology relationship?
I would probably ask Catherine or maybe someone from the technical team, DWR. Did you kind of encounter this with your evaluations?
Catherine, are you still online here?
I am, yes, yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, so yeah, I can jump in on that a little bit. So the data quality was reviewed before we developed the resistivity to lithology transform. So as a part of that process, the team went through and evaluated the cuttings descriptions. And so they had criteria of how many descriptions were there per depth, or how many words were used per description, for example. So the quality of the log was first evaluated And then we also evaluated the location of the log. So to ensure that the log was accurately located, not just in the center of the public land surveying square, but had an accurate location as well. So all of these things were first evaluated, the quality of the log before it was used in the transfer. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine.
Mhm.
All right. I'll the next two questions that are on here are for Emily and Victoria. So I think I might go in reverse order here, just 'cause I think the next question may be a little bit faster, which is was the deep aquifer study you conducted with Ramble within a pretty urbanized area? In general, what would you recommend for GSAs located in urban areas looking to improve their HCM where AEM data do not exist?
Take this?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Victoria.
Sure. The majority of the
Salinas Valley Basin is agricultural. However, some of that agriculture is vineyard. And so we actually could not fly several lines over the vineyards because of the interference with the materials used for the grapes and the vines. And then of course we do have the city of Salinas and a few other small communities down basin. And this has presented a real data gap in crucial areas where we wanted a lot more information. So one of the things we've talked about is possibly looking at Totem to get at some of those subsurface areas where a flight just would not be appropriate. And we've also looked at some of those areas for filling in data gaps with wells or boreholes to see further, but using some of the well completion reports that we have, we were able to get at some of those subsurface features that confirmed where we had both AEM and well completion reports working together, and then understanding the relationship that we had with the well completion reports and the AEM data, we could use well completion reports in those areas where we had no AEM and still be able to extrapolate information underneath those highly urban or more developed with the vineyards areas. And then just a little bit to the previous question in terms of the quality of the well completion reports, some of the qualities weren't very good, but I will say particularly for the East Side Subbasin, the drillers do always know when they hit bedrock. So that was, whether the log was good or bad, we actually still always knew where bedrock was. So that was helpful.
Thanks, Victoria. All right, I'll go to the last question. I think we have just enough time to answer it. Again, for Emily and Victoria, I would like to know more about the more powerful tool used by Ramble in the Lower Salinas Valley to see deeper than standard AEM, availability, price, etc.
Oh gosh. Well, I would strongly recommend
Reaching out to Ramble and discussing that with them. We pushed really hard to understand the limitations of what AEM data, where AEM data could be collected in the subsurface. So there were several lead-up meetings into how powerful of a tool we could use, really the depth that we could get at in the subsurface. And there was a lot of logistical discussion back and forth. If I remember correctly, they had to bring this tool in from Canada because I think it was the only one that they had available. So they had to import it from Canada specifically for the purposes of our project. But we discussed with them as well, since they are the geophysical experts, were there other geophysical methods that could let us see at greater depth before we got to AEM, because we just weren't sure if AEM data could go to the depths that we really needed. And so we talked about gravity, we talked about seismic, we talked about several different options, but dollar per data, AEM data is just, you get so much more data for your dollar. So even though a more powerful tool was a bit more expensive and we had to fly fewer lines because the helicopter had to go slower and there were other limitations, it still wound up being, I think, the best use of our money. I don't remember the exact cost off the top of my head, but I think what we got out of it provided enormous value. So you would have to talk to the experts on what that cost is and what that tool is. I went into it a little bit in the slide, but it was a strong, highly specialized push on our end, and they were able to come through.
Thanks, Victoria. I think we'll go ahead and and pause here. Just wanted to say thank you again to all of our panelists. I think it was a great discussion. I definitely encourage folks, if you have more questions about this, to reach out. Stantec team's been putting in links in the chat to be able to get in contact with you all. So just thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And then I think we're going to have a short break here. So please return to the meeting room by 10:25, and thank you all. All right, everyone. Welcome back from the break. I know that wasn't a ton of time, but hopefully everybody got a little bit of rest there. We're now going to move into the second informational session from DWR. We're going to be joined by Stephen Springhorn, the Basin Characterization Program Manager, and Catherine DeLubeck, who you've also you've heard from earlier, who is the Basin Characterization Project Manager. They're going to provide a deeper dive into the Basin Characterization Program and highlight how AEM supports this effort. So take it away, Stephen and Catherine.
All right. Well, thank you, Keith, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Really excited to be talking with you today and engaging with you more in the breakout sessions that are coming next. And so my name is Stephen Springhorn, and I'm serving as the Basin Characterization Program Manager at DWR and working closely with Catherine and the team on spinning up this new exciting basin characterization effort. And so Catherine and I are going to tag team these next couple slides and really trying to build from this morning's discussion. Catherine talked about all the great work that has happened on AEM data collection across the state. We had that great panel discussion describing how AEM information is going into basin characterization. And so the goal of this presentation is to really show how we're structuring that basin characterization program to be moving forward and continuing to provide additional information as we go. So I just wanted to highlight on this slide, there's a lot of logos there, and it just represents the huge team and expertise that we have brought to this very complex topic. And I really appreciate everyone's hard work on this as well. So next slide, please. All right, that's me. So let's see here. Here we go. So one of the questions we get a lot about as we're spinning up this basin characterization program is why are we doing this? Why is DWR doing this? And Paul, Deputy Director Goslin, at the beginning really highlighted there's been a steady march to better understanding of California's groundwater basins throughout many decades. And that's really represented or reflected by and necessitated by the fact that groundwater is being used more and more each decade in California. And so there's really a big driver on trying to get more and more information on California's groundwater. So a big reason why we're doing this is because there's a huge need like never before and demand on our groundwater basins. And that demand is reflected in a greater demand in management, sustainable groundwater management, droughts, floods, all these different things. We need more information to better manage our biggest form of natural infrastructure in California and storage, which are our groundwater basins. And so, but when we come back to it at a fundamental level, why we're doing this is because we're required in the water code to characterize California's groundwater basins. And this is something that the department has done since the 50s and 60s. And it's been pretty episodic, but it's been a slow march, as mentioned earlier, to getting more information. And that really is coming in the form of Bulletin 118, California's groundwater. And so that is our primary document across the state that we compile the state of the state's groundwater information and required to do that under the water code. And that information has started again back in the 50s through the 70s, 80s, and then into the 2000s with episodic updates over time. And now we're required to update that every 5 years. And the latest update, 2025, is in the works and is being worked on right now. But we know that, as mentioned, there's so many more demands on the groundwater basins and aquifers. There's a need under SGMA and everything else that's happening in California water and groundwater to get more information out. Not every 5 years, that's too slow. But Bulletin 118 really represents that great archiving ability to take what we do know at the time, put it out there to make sure everyone can understand it and see it over time. And then really it's an ability for us to cast a vision of where we continue to need to go in groundwater to continue building understanding and better management. And so just a couple of the things, because every 5 years is too slow for the amount of information is being generated in California's groundwater and that's needed. We've developed a couple of new products under California's groundwater, which is the semi-annual conditions report. The latest spring 2024 report just came out the beginning of this month. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that report that has the latest information on California's groundwater in the historic year that was water year 2023. And then finally, on the highest frequency, maybe less detail level, is California's Groundwater Live, which is updated daily and provides up-to-the-day information on water levels, land subsidence, well infrastructure, and other data sets that allow you can sort by your address, by basin, by hydrologic region, and statewide. So I encourage you to take a look at those items as well. So now, really, we're trying to showcase the different connections on basin characterization to how it fits into the high-level Bulletin 118, California's groundwater activities at the top, and then also some other activities. So together, we're making sure that there's connected, aligned activities as we're all moving together going forward. So the center part of this area is what we're talking about today, and continuing to build on is the basin characterization efforts. And as mentioned, this has started decades ago and has been a steady build in information as groundwater studies have been done. A tremendous amount of work has been done at the local level to better understand groundwater basins, as well as a lot of work that the department did back in the early days to do some fundamental work on studying and characterizing groundwater basins. And so we're continuing to build off of that. There's been a long hiatus in that for lack of funding and different priorities at the state. But with SGMA and everything else, there's been a big shift to more resources available and more efforts. As you all know, as GSAs, with all the work that you've just put in and have over the last almost 10 years now in defining your hydrogeologic conceptual models, putting those into your groundwater sustainability plans, that is now a huge amount of new information, best available information that has now been compiled that we're building off of, not duplicating, but building off of, combining that great information with our statewide AEM surveys. And then we'll be building onto that as we go through additive analysis like local pilots that Catherine will talk more about, regional studies, texture modeling, and then working in this information into other efforts that our colleagues at the department are stewarding, like the Central Valley Simulation Model, or C2B Sim, and other local models. So it's exciting times in basin characterization. We're just starting out, but we're building off a good legacy and building into the future with, as we know, an important need for more of this information. And then just the foundational part of this is the data. It's important to just highlight that the data is largely overlooked in many cases, but it's so important to have consistent and standardized data sets for us all to use and rely on. And so the department has been working for decades, and then really since SGMA was passed over this last 10 years, really putting an emphasis on collecting those high quality data sets that are needed for SGMA implementation. And so another important part of this is not just collecting data for data's sake, but really making sure it's accessible. And so Catherine went into this and we'll highlight it more, but we're finding and making sure we have different ways to get information out that are consistent, but also cater to different audiences. So from a more public general audience, we have different data viewers that we've created, like California's Groundwater Live, the Sigma data viewer, the 2D and 3D data viewers that Catherine already showcased, and then open data, making sure that all of this information resides on an open data platform so you all and others can get easy access to it. So again, all of this is really meant to continue to build the awareness, the access, and then feed this information into continued groundwater management and informing projects and actions like we heard about from the panel discussion. So we have three main categories or pillars of our basin characterization program. And it really starts with continuing to compile and collect data. So the statewide AEM surveys, as you already heard, was a big improvement in that, a big data set with over 15,000 line miles of new information for us to chew on. But we're going to continue our efforts there because, as Victoria mentioned, had a great point in her presentation, was that the power of AEM is when you combine it with other data sets. And so that really resonates, and that's exactly what we're trying to do, is really combine all these together and then bring them into higher levels of understanding and analysis, which is that next step, which is we're going to be stewarding texture models and hydrostratigraphic models for key areas of the state, like the Central Valley, and providing tool sets that you all can do that in your areas of interest at your scale of interest to meet your objectives. And really hitting on objectives is we're really guiding this whole program by some key objectives and use cases that we've heard from a lot of you and others across the state, that we need more information about primary aquifers, extent of clays, recharge is very big, as we know and heard already, interconnected surface water, subsidence, and then some of the water quality in disadvantaged communities or drinking water aspects of basin characterization. So those are the things that are really driving us as we continue to build out this program, and we'll be very focused in making sure that the tools and the models and the information that we put out is in tune with those needs and helping address those needs as we go. And so in these two first steps, compiling data and doing something with it, essentially, it's an iterative process. It's a cycle. It has been for decades, as mentioned, and it will for decades to come. And we're going to be tuning that cycle of this with those questions that we have already identified, and really questions that you all have, new questions that it'd be great to hear more about that today and as we go moving forward. And then the final step is just that continuing to put down what we do know in our data archive in California's Groundwater Bulletin 118, so that we can continue to build the state's knowledge and have that repository of information for us all to build off of. And then one final element, and already showcased in Catherine's slides, is we're just really trying to make sure that this information, although very complex, multi-layered, very detailed, it needs to be accessible and visual and able to be visualized. So we're not having too high of a bar for entry, because that groundwater is already a complex space. So we're really trying to lower that bar of entry and understanding. And so I think by adding some new data viewers, that is helpful, but it's also continuing to touch base with the GSA community and the communities you all are working with and working for in the ground or on the ground. So really building a community of practice at the basin level, regional level, and with our state and federal partners and NGO and academia and all the rest. And so really that's the overarching plan of our program. And now I'll turn it over to Catherine to go over some of the more detailed elements of each step.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephen. Let's see. So I'm just gonna think I have control here. You just go back for a second. Great. So thank you, Stephen, for describing the basin characterization program and showing us how it fits into the California's groundwater umbrella of work. So I'm going to go into now in a little bit more detail into each activity, the type of data we're going to collect and compile, the tools we'll have, the types of state stewarded texture or models and maps that we're going to provide for you all. So you have a better understanding of exactly how we can help support you in the work that you're doing and the types of work that we'll be doing statewide. Okay, so first starting on that first tier of data compilation and collection, I'm just gonna start out with the data compilation component. So I mentioned this in the statewide, in the AEM survey portion, and we're gonna continue to build upon that work, which is really to continue to gather, review the quality, determine the location, and then digitize both lithology and geophysical logs. So lithology, of course, is important information. And then the geophysical logs, advanced geophysical logs like SP logs and E logs and gamma, various different types of logs that are going to give us an improved understanding of what's happening in the subsurface. So we don't just have these logs available as a PDF. We have them available then in digital format so we can use them in the integrated analysis tools that I'm going to mention in a moment. Okay, and then with the data collection. So as Stephen mentioned, we are going to continue to collect data, but now through a little bit more of a focused way in a series of pilot studies. So the goal of the pilot studies is to really be exploring methods and techniques that address specific SGMA implementation initiatives, like Stephen went through: groundwater recharge, interconnected surface water, base of fresh water, seawater intrusion, things like this. And create guidance for both the state for us to use, but then also for you guys to use as well as you start to go through and investigate these different initiatives. We now have a broader range of tools available to support us in this work. So of course we have the Course Reconnaissance Grid, AEM, but we still have access to the helicopter and the geophysical equipment. We can go in now and collect infill AEM where needed, and if it's appropriate to address the questions. We can go in and collect TOTEM and FLOTEM data. So I think we already heard a few of the panelists talk about TOTEM. This is, of course, the same type of electromagnetic method. So we're collecting electrical resistivity data, but now this is collected behind an ATV, and it's going to give us better resolution in the shallow subsurface. We can also deploy this behind a boat. We can collect it over water and get a better understanding of what's happening below a riverbed, may be helpful for understanding interconnected surface water. We can go in and collect advanced geophysical logs, E-logs, nuclear magnetic resonance, and other information that will be helpful for us to understand various questions. And then, of course, we have this suite of standard geological methods and hydrogeological methods that we could employ. So then we have a series of pilot studies that we'll be conducting. I'm showing 3 here, but we do plan to have more. So the first will be focused on groundwater recharge, and then interconnected surface water, and domestic wells and subsidence. And I show these 3 as 3 different studies, but in fact, everywhere in California and most places, a lot of these components are happening together or at once. So there's, so looking at just groundwater recharge or interconnected surface water, and a lot of places, all of these things are happening together. So, so we'll be looking at various components or various initiatives in each of these pilot studies. And I just want to take a few moments to highlight the first pilot study that we already have underway, focused on groundwater recharge, to give you an idea of the type of process that we're going through, which is really actually, I think, very similar to the process that that we heard from the panelists, the process that we're going through to define recharge sites or look at other questions. So our pilot study 1 site is along the Upper San Joaquin and between the Upper San Joaquin and the Fresno rivers, just northeast of Fresno and east of Madera. So we're working with the North Kings GSA and also the Madera GSA. In this area, we have a few things happening. We have dry domestic wells shown here in these yellow, red, and green dots. So we know that we have that there could be a need for some shallow recharge to support these dry domestic wells. We also have other work already underway in the area, in these red outlines here, where we have DWR's FloodMAR team, the Flood Managed Aquifer Recharge Group, already working in this area, looking at developing, they call it their EcoFIP tool, that's Ecological Flood Inundation Potential tool, so better understanding recharge and habitat rehabilitation along river systems. We also know that in this area, we have these alluvial fans or these incised valley fills that we already heard Cassie mention and describe that Graham Fogg and his students had defined some time ago. And so we know that these could be possible areas to get water quickly back into the ground. We also have our airborne electromagnetic, our AEM statewide survey data, where here we're just showing the AEM data in the top 50 feet, where the reds and yellows are those very coarse dominated areas. And just as Cassie had mentioned, there seem to be some of these areas that are coarse dominated, that are outside of where we think these alluvial fans are, that might be these needles in a haystack to get water quickly back into the ground, right? So we know that some of these areas are good recharge areas, but could there be more? So the goals we have for the work that we're doing in this area include improving our understanding of recharge features, both in the shallow subsurface, so to get water quickly back into the ground anywhere, and then also recharge features to get water quickly back, or not quickly, but back into a deeper aquifer, right? So where those deeper aquifers daylight on the eastern side of the valley. And then also to characterize the native material underneath the river system here to improve groundwater flow models. So and to improve our understanding of the surface water groundwater interaction, specifically working with the EcoFIP team over here. So a workflow for this is that we first collected infill AEM data, and we did this actually similar to the Salinas Valley study. Instead of collecting deep AEM data, we actually had the team investigate new ways to collect AEM data, now focusing on the shallower subsurface. So instead of going deeper, we said we want actually more resolution in the shallow subsurface. So we tested a new methodology out here, and I'll show you that data set after the slide. We will then also be creating for this area a recharge suitability and aquifer connectivity map. We're going to do this in really a very, very similar way to what Charles described in Yuba County. And then using that map, working with the GSAs to find parcels and willing sellers, as Cassie had mentioned, and willing sellers to find parcels where we could have potential fast paths to a deeper aquifer, and then going back and going into those parcels, we're willing sellers and we have potential good recharge, and conducting some field work to understand if there may be barriers in the shallow subsurface that would inhibit flow. So going in and collecting totem data or flow temp data along the river to understand the shallow subsurface beneath the river system, and then going back and collecting other traditional methods that will help us better characterize and understand the system. I'm going to now go through and show you the data that we have. Let me pause this just for a second. I want to show you a video of the data that we have in this area. This is a video that Ian Gottschalk put together for us from Ramble, and it's going to show first the electrical resistivity from the statewide survey, and then we're going to go into some more detailed information. I'll walk you through this as we go. Oh, sorry, let me go back. Uh-oh. Okay, so we have the statewide survey. We're looking at the electrical resistivity data here. We're going to then add in the infill AEM data that we collected. that you see there. We then have now the digitized lithology logs that were used to create the resistivity to lithology transform. And then we're going to look at the data as the coarse fraction. So now we're looking at the interpretation of the AEM data for texture. These areas in yellow and green are above 50% coarse. Now we can start to see and visualize these pathways. Here we can see where those 50% coarse, this is just looking in the gridded AEM data, but now you can see where we can have these pathways from the surface, somewhere up here, down to a deeper aquifer, right? And we can look at this, it's just gonna step through another area. So I'm gonna skip through that because we are limited on time here. Here it is. Again, looking, seeing this connection to this deeper aquifer. So we're using the AEM data along with other data sets, along with SAGB data, along, as described by Charles, really to look at shallow pathways and the deeper pathways to the aquifer. So I wanted to highlight also how we are choosing these pilot studies. We are choosing them first and foremost based on the available resources we have. So available staff at DWR and contracting mechanisms that we have to do this work. Of course, we are in a limiting time of funding, so this is something that we really have to consider very, very carefully. But given we have available resources, we are considering several components, including equity. So we want to make sure that we're implementing these pilot studies in areas that could really most benefit from this work, so frontline communities or disadvantaged communities, as well as the SIGMA implementation questions, right? So what do we need to know, or what's the question in this specific area, and how it is important, that question, to other GSAs and to the state. We're also looking at multi-benefits. So as I mentioned before, habitat rehabilitation or other benefits, state initiatives, so the water resiliency portfolio, we want to be in alignment with that, as well as supporting agencies within a basin. So who else is working there who can support, and regional distribution. We want to make sure that we're covering areas throughout the state. And so if you have interest or if you have suggestions for specific SIGMA implementation questions or initiatives you want us to look at, or if you have a proposed pilot study in your basin, I would encourage you to fill out the GSA forum survey that's going to come out after this forum, where there'll be several questions, including these ones specifically, and so you can provide input and information for us on these pilot studies. Okay, so the analysis tools, we're running short on time. I'm going to go quickly. The analysis tools that we're developing are going to be made available both for us to use and also for you all to use as well. So the first one is data to texture. So this will be a tool that will integrate the statewide AEM survey data, infill data, other data sets that we have, along with additional data sets. So, right, another piece to AEM is a piece of the puzzle, not the entire puzzle itself. So along with other data sets to create that texture model, which is, again, traditionally looked at in groundwater flow modeling, but is really actually a very interesting and rich data set. From there, we will also be developing a texture to PAR tool and a data to HSM tool. So the texture to PAR tool is really focused on the groundwater modeling component. So with this, we're integrating the texture data as a starting point with other measured model parameters to create aquifer parameters, because those aquifer parameters go into your groundwater flow model. Then there's the data to hydrostratigraphic model, where we have the texture data, the texture model, along with additional subsurface data. So water quality, isotope analyses, other logging data, plus geologic expertise to create the hydrostratigraphic model. Okay, and I'm actually just going to run through this really quick. I think we got through most of these. What I really want to highlight here are the state stewarded maps and models that we are hoping to provide for you all. So as I mentioned, the tools will be available for us to use and you to use, and we are hoping to use those tools that I just showed you to run them regularly as we collect new data, as we digitize new data, Okay, as we digitize new data, to update these models and maps. So the types of models and maps that we are going to come out with are recharge suitability and aquifer connectivity maps. And again, I don't have a slide here going into the details of how we're doing that, but it's very, very similar to what John presented, integrating different data sets, not just the AEM, but other texture data, the texture data, but other data sets into understanding recharge suitability, aquifer connectivity. Let's see, also if the texture model will be state stewarded and updated, as well as aquifer storage. So understanding, through time as, in the semi-annual reports or even in the Cal Groundwater Live, where water levels are compared to the surface, how much space we have, how much storage we might have in the subsurface to get water back in, how full our aquifers are, aiming towards that type of analysis and regular upkeep of data sets, as well as the hydrostratigraphic model and traditional hydrogeologic conceptual model components like aquifer layers, extent of clays, depth of basement, base of fresh water. Okay, and then lastly, lastly, very quickly, I think we've already discussed this enough, but we are continuing to advance our data visualization. So working to make sure that we have ways to view various different data sets online at once, and also ways for us to curate that data so that it's easily accessible and ready for the public to view. So just ensuring that, again, as Stephen mentioned, the bar to entry is low. All right, and I'm going to hand it back over to Stephen here. He's going to pull it all back together and give you a timeline for when you can expect these components to come out. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Catherine. Just since we're running a little short on time, it's every time we talk basin characterization, there's just so much to talk about, and time flies. But we're almost getting to the point where we're going to have breakout sessions, and we'll have a lot more time to discuss in detail. So looking forward to that. So really how all these pieces fit together, there's so much going on. We just want to show that we can't do everything at once. So we're going to have an overarching framework to be building into the long term through California's Groundwater Bulletin 118. But then we're going to be learning by doing on the ground in the pilots that Catherine mentioned, and really trying to highlight and spotlight what you all are doing across the state as GSA leaders and working through these basin characterization efforts. So the old adage, think globally about the framework of how things can fit together, but then act locally and understand locally to inform local management. Okay, so the next slide here. So timeline, this has been communicated in various formats, and you'll have time to study this in more detail, but essentially above the line, we're going to continue to work on the ground with GSAs that you've already heard from and others across the state through our pilot studies. And then below the line are all the more statewide or programmatic deliverables that we're working towards in the next 3 to 5 years. And an important line at the very bottom is that basin characterization work group. It's something we haven't spun up just yet, but it's something that is going to be an important venue for us to continue these conversations and for you to provide input on what matters to you and your communities in your basin, so we can continue to stay in tune and in touch with that. And then finally, just knowing that we're all going to be working together on this. We have different scales, different scopes or objectives, different resource availability, and that's all going to be coming and going. So we want as much as possible. We do not want to be duplicating effort. So the more that we can be in touch and in communication, the better. So we can be helping each other through, collaborating with each other, the work group. If you're interested in getting signed up for that work group when it does kick off, please email basin characterization at water.ca.gov. We'll put the link in the chat, and just really want to commend everyone for all the hard work that you've already done this past 10 years or so in developing and working towards basin characterization. And the future is really bright because we're going to be building off of what you've already done to really help you inform your management over the next 10 years of SGMA. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Keith.
Just wanted to thank everyone for participating, in the breakout sessions and then just the event in general. As we're wrapping up here, I wanted to share a few DWR assistance updates. Next slide, please. Thank you. So DWR, continues to provide and build upon, our various assistance efforts. And here are a few things that we've either recently released or plan to release, this calendar year. So first is the semi-annual groundwater conditions report. The spring 2024 semi-annual conditions report was released in early May. It illustrated the big boost the 2023 water year delivered to our groundwater supplies. And it also showed that there's still more progress to be made in addressing the long-term groundwater level decline. But the next groundwater conditions report is going to be released in the fall. Next, I want to talk about the Verbal Interpretive Services Program. DWR also just launched this program to make engagement equally accessible to all community members by offering GSAs and local entities simultaneous interpretation services at GSA and other local SGMA-related events. The Verbal Interpretive Services Program website is actually now live. I think just as of today or late yesterday, GSAs can submit applications for this service. Next, I want to talk about the Interconnected Surface Water Guidance document. DWR's document is going to be on the sustainable management of depletions of interconnected surface water due to groundwater pumping. The guidance will be supported by 3 topic papers that cover interconnected surface water identification and approaches, for estimating timing, location, and quantity of depletion from groundwater pumping. The first topic paper was released earlier this year, and then the next 2 are going to be released late spring or early summer. And then the guidance document itself will follow the release of these topic papers, and it's anticipated to get released later this year. We have a subsidence best management practices document that we're working on. The BMP is going to describe activities, practices, and procedures to meet the intent of SGMA and to avoid or minimize subsidence. And its target release is later this year. We're looking at the fall time frame. And then the last thing here, we want to talk about Oscar 2.0. We're going to have a rollout of Oscar 2.0 expected later this summer. Through this release, DWR is going to expand its functionality and then the data contained in the well completion report catalog that we collect at the department. Next slide, please. So also want to talk about the SGMA 10-year anniversary celebration that we're planning. So again, we're looking to celebrate the 10-year signing of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So in trying to recognize this major milestone, the DWR Sustainable Groundwater Management Office, or SGMA as we call ourselves, is planning to host a day-long event to recognize the immense amount of work that's not only happened from the Groundwater Sustainability Agencies, but also those active in supporting the planning and implementation of SGMA. So we're really excited about this. We have a tentative schedule right now for October, late October of this year, but we're going to have that specific date, I think, solidified here pretty soon, and we'll share that through our SGMA newsletter. Next slide, please. So as we're wrapping up, wanted to share a few next step items with you. As we talked about earlier, really would appreciate you completing the event survey on basin characterization, on the basin characterization program. We're going to provide the link to that in the chat. This is an important survey related to the program and that Catherine mentioned earlier in her presentations. And it's really a space where you can help inform and shape the program. So we really value your input and would love to have you complete that survey. Please also keep an eye out for some post-event materials. This includes a recording of the panel presentations and the question and answer session, and then also a directory of forum participants. You should receive this via direct email in early June. And then we're also going to provide a list of the resources that we've referenced during the event. I know we've provided a lot of different links in the chat, so that'll be included there. We'll also heavily encourage you to attend that 10-year SGMA anniversary, which is also going to be basically our fall GSA forum. in October, so please be on the lookout for that. And then if you have any questions about the forum or really anything related to our program in general, please send those to our sgmps@water.ca.gov email account. We have somebody that's constantly monitoring that account. Next slide, please. So again, just thank you all for attending today's GSA forum event. We just really appreciate your engagement, in the breakout sessions and the questions you provided. It just also just being a participant in this as well. Then a huge thank you to our forum panelists, Christina, Cassie, Emily, Victoria, and Charles. Just we couldn't have done this without you. Thank you for taking the time to develop your presentations and then your willingness to share your lessons learned. And then thank you to Stantec for helping us organize and run this event. Particularly thank you to Atlee for facilitating and operating our breakout sessions. Christy for hosting the Zoom meeting, and then Condrell, Marissa, and Marina for monitoring the chat and the question and answer portal. And then I know there's many others that have been working behind the scenes to support this event, so thank you for that. Definitely want to thank the rest of the DWR team for supporting the breakout sessions. It was very helpful. And then lastly, huge thank you to Amelia Wisniewski and Marissa Listel from DWR for planning, organizing, and leading this event. Absolutely could not have done this without you. Really appreciate your involvement there. We really strive to do our best to make this an event that is appealing for all of you to attend and worthwhile with your time. And I know Amelia and Marissa have really put a lot of time in developing the program, so thank you. So that does it for the Spring 24 GSA Forum. We look forward to seeing you all at the next event. I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great Memorial Day weekend. So thank you all. Take care and talk to you soon.